Hi, gang. Here we go with our last installment of Professor Eagan's note walkthrough. Looking through some of the PowerPoint notes and picking out some main points from our text, just to make sure that you give the best possible ability to know what's going on and to score well on the upcoming final exam. Biggest thing here, guys, that we want to talk about within chapter 14, when it comes to the stuff that we're looking at with Aquinas and scholasticism, is this, I don't want to say age-old debate, but it's a still to this day a very prescient and roaring type of debate in philosophical circles and theological circles, and thus historical circles, is rationalism, which is, reason, empiricism, Aristotelianism, those types of things, all right, the thinking of Aristotle, versus revealed truth. And revealed truth is that type of prophetic truth, that prophetic tradition that you know from the scriptures, which is that God chooses certain members of us humans from time to time, and these people are called prophets, and he kind of pulls back the curtain of truth to reveal to the prophet certain truths about life. And then that prophet is to then go tell it to the rest of us, and thus you get that revealed scriptural truth. For many in the Middle Ages, this simply was not sufficient in terms of satisfying their intellectual curiosity. And so they began, like we talked about, to rediscover Aristotle and to start to enjoy some of the truths that can be built from empirical data and rational, reasoned thinking. And that's what we get this experiment in the late Middle Ages. We get this experiment that moves us into and reveals to us, pardon the pun, certain people like Thomas Aquinas, whom you see here. Thomas Aquinas was born in Italy to a noble family. Now, very similar roots that we see with a lot of people that we looked at, going back even to when we looked at the biographies of St. Martin. Noble birth, a person that then sees his work as being a different type of work and begins then to reject his noble roots in search of other paths. All right. For more on the bio with Aquinas, please reference the links on Canvas and your textbook to pick up more with the bio on Aquinas. But the big thing, guys, is to have an understanding that in the 1300s, 1400s, medieval thinking changes. It switches to much more reasoned, rational proofs to illuminate certain things within the Christian faith, that instead of just relying on saying, well, it's in the Bible, it's in Scripture, so therefore it's true, we have to take these scriptural writers and even the church fathers like St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome. They used a lot of justification for their writings with, well, it's in Scripture, so therefore it's true. Like I said before, this simply does not compute and work anymore with the minds of the Middle Ages, especially this guy named St. Thomas Aquinas. They needed more proof. They simply needed more concrete, tangible, empirical data and proof for things that were worked out within the Christian faith. And what they felt was that if they could reconstruct Christian faith to prove things within Christianity outside of the scriptures with no reliance on the scriptures, if they could prove things within Christianity by using tangible worldly things, well, then all the better for Christian believers, that not only are their truths proven out in scripture, but also their truths are proven out in things that you can observe in the everyday life. Something as simple as, a rainbow or building up those types of truths within the real world. If we look at this guy again, Thomas Aquinas, again, sorry if you hear that noise in the background, it's just my lovely dog, Chandler, who's decided to have a giant drink of water right in the middle of me doing notes, as she always does, because, well, we love her. You about done there getting that drink, Chandler? He joins this Dominican monastery, and like I said, he rejects his noble past. And if you can, pick up on more of that canvas and text for an additional bio on Aquinas. Simply, this guy was a prodigious writer, no doubt about it. He's the most prodigious writer of the Middle Ages. The only one that came close to him would be the Venerable Bede from his monasteries in Anglo-Saxon England. Over 4,000 pages of original work, of original thought, mainly contained within those two texts and portions of the text that I'm having you look at for our work tomorrow. There again is another one of my dogs. Jesse now is having a drink of water. So if you guys can hear that in the background, that's my second dog now having a giant drink of water. Awesome. The Summa Contra Gentiles, who we are reading for tomorrow in our session. Hopefully you guys can pick up on some of the cool things within that kind of handbook about, and we talked about why drinking and the carnal pleasures of the physical world are not good for human beings. Just a textbook look at scholastic truth and scholastic thought. And that's where we are here with this scholastic method. Thomas Aquinas uses that scholastic method, and pick up on those terms from your chapters, looking at pages 422, 23, and even in 24 and 25. I know that the note here says 433, but it means 423 and 424. And we talked about this in our session on Tuesday, that this is kind of a proto-scientific method. It's a methodological approach. It's tedious. Questions are posited. Dispute and evidence is given, then refuted, then we have the therefore, this is what's proven, all right? It is at once an idealistic and arrogant, quite frankly, attempt to coalesce and bring every essence and piece of human knowledge into one book. And that's really what the Summa Theologica was. Written over the course of 9 years. Make sure you pick up on it from page 427. We're reading a selection of it from the Quinque Viae, the 5 ways. But page 427 really gets into what this Summa Theologica was all about. Just an immense work. The quintessential, prototypical scholastic philosophic book. All right. And I hope that you enjoyed kind of reading through it. The Quinque Viae, those 5 ways, really is the only enjoyable, I guess you want to call it, part of the book to read. A lot of it is very tedious and kind of goes through some what we would consider today boring parts of these things. In essence, to sum up on the Summa Theologica, your book does a great job doing it. It's not an easy book to read, as Bachman says on page 427, but scholastic works like these are tremendous because they're important as cultural phenomena. The end of his life is really interesting, though, and I have it down here in our notes. Aquinas has a vision in 1272, towards the end of his life, in which he has this dream and this vision that the universe is not something that you can prove, and that God's existence is not something that can be proven. And as your book says, that the universe is something larger, stranger, and inexplicable. And he emerged from that conviction he emerged from that revelation, it says, with the conviction that everything I've written seems to be mere straw. And he gave himself over to pious simplicity and died soon after. It's a really interesting end of his life because he works his entire life to try and prove these truths with empirical data and with reasoned, rational thinking. And then towards the end of his life, he has this vision and says, it's all straw. The universe is much more complex than any human being could possibly imagine. It's certainly an interesting life and one that I hope that you enjoyed looking at this week in our notes. The final part of our notes that I want to look at is these unbelievable late medieval architectural innovations, the cathedrals, which begin to be talked about in your book on page 428. What an interesting time period. This picture here is from an illuminated manuscript showing just how intricate these building processes were. You see, the ladders and the pulleys and the levers and the work and the community nature that went into building these projects. These were entire communities that took entire generations to build. I'm again bringing up that point that as the Crusades were popular manifestations of faith, so too are the cathedrals popular manifestations of faith. You look for tangible examples, physical examples of faith in action. The cathedrals are probably the best example of that, to be sure. There's two types of cathedrals, Romanesque and Gothic. Guaranteed question on the final exam. Remember, we talked about this the other day during the session. Guaranteed question on the final exam is, are you able to pick out by looking at it a Romanesque versus a Gothic cathedral and explain why. Explain to the reader why that particular picture is Romanesque or that particular picture is Gothic. There's a lot of different things that bring out Romanesque style. Watch those videos, pick up on those traits again. I'm just listing them here to be quick. But big, dark, simplistic interiors, not a lot of windows, big vaulted, round, thick stone walls and arches, those types of things. And you can see it. Also, one of the, with this look at the floor plan, very prototypical Romanesque floor plan. You can see this again on page, they describe it again on page 430. Check out the symmetry. Look at the symmetry of the Romanesque floor plan. This one, obviously, and most of them are going to be in the form of a cross. And you can see the different parts of the building, from the transept and the nave and all that stuff, and all those terms that you're going to pick up on from your reading. But symmetry is that thing that I want you to look at with Romanesque, right? The symmetry of St. Philibert in France. You can see the two towers of equal distance. You can see the rounded arches here, all right? The rounded arches, the small windows, okay? Big, thick walls, very Romanesque in essence. Look at the symmetry again from this view. You can see, again, exact heights, not a lot of windows, all right, and big, thick, strong walls. One of the aspects, again, as we look at another picture here of the interior of Romanesque cathedrals, is look at how there's not, sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Look at how there's not nearly the light that you imagine being in medieval cathedrals, or certainly that you're going to see with Gothic cathedrals. The interior of Romanesque churches need a lot of candles. They need a lot of help to light themselves up. And that's just because you can see the rounded arches, the big, thick walls. The stones are going to need big, thick supports on the side to hold them up. The physics of it all, Make sure you're picking up on the physics of these buildings. They do a great job of that in both videos on Canvas and a little bit in the book as well. The Gothic Cathedral, though, is the one that everybody tends to have their eyes drawn towards, because they're just simply magnificently unbelievable buildings that you look at and you're like, man, how did people build these in the 1200s, 1300s, and 1400s? And the fact that they still stand is amazing. Basically, guys, and you picked up on this guy's name, hopefully, from watching the videos. The Abbot Suger is credited with starting the Gothic cathedral experience. Through light, the dull mind is resurrected to truth, is the famous line of the Abbot Suger, who completely redid architecturally the design of Saint Denis in France. The critics scoffed at it, all right, and basically said it's unusual, it's bizarre, it's something that a barbarian Goth, one of the Visigoths, one of the Ostrogoths would build. And so the name Gothic at first, it was a pejorative, it was a put down. It was people looking at the Church of Saint Denis, you can see here, and they're like, well, where's the other part of it? Where's this part? Why is it asymmetrical? It looks like a Goth built it. And so it got this name Gothic because of that. But the thing is, as these buildings continue throughout the 1200s, 1300s, and even into the 1400s, these buildings get more ornate, taller, and just more spectacular the more you look at them. Prototypical Gothic floor plan, as you can see here, is completely asymmetrical. You got parts going off in a bunch of different directions. There's no real symmetry to the transept and the nave area, and where the congregation is going to sit. The thing that strikes me about Gothic floor plans and Gothic cathedral building is that it all seems kind of ad hoc, meaning that it was just kind of piece by piece by piece, and they're like, well, let's build that, let's try that, see if that works. Gothic cathedrals, the early parts of Gothic cathedrals, guys, were a lot of trial and error. There were lots of building collapses, lots of walls that got too tall and too big and too thin too quickly without enough support on the sides, as we're going to talk about here in a minute. How do you continue to support larger and larger and thinner walls filled with glass with a roof? How are you going to support that? And these buildings begin to show you how they do that. But the abbey inside of the Church of Saint Denis is just gorgeous. It shows you the ribbed vaulting, the pointed arch, which are all points of to note, to figure out what is Gothic and what is Romanesque. The strength of these buildings are these many ribbed vaults that come down in the supports and take that weight of the ceiling and send it down in as many ways as possible through that pointed arch. Whereas if you think about it, if you have a rounded arch, the weight is going kind of out this way. But if you extend it to a point, you can draw the weight much more downward into the ground. Okay, these are architectural things. They're physics things. Sometimes usually things that historians don't like talking about or worrying about. But some of the most important historical buildings have a lot of physics behind them. The emphasis, again, is on height. How can we get as much light? Because the Abbot Suger, remember, talked about it is through light that we experience God. And so the point was trying to get as much light, as much awesome space as possible in these buildings. As you look at some of these buildings, you can start to see the lack of symmetry in the Gothic architecture. But you can also see some of the main interesting points, those pointed arches. But also, again, if you ever, if you're looking at this for, for testing purposes and final exam stuff, you see lack of symmetry, that's an immediate kind of giveaway that this is a Gothic cathedral that you're looking at. Here's the front of the Cathedral de Notre Dame in Paris. These are pre-fire pictures. It suffered a terrible fire about 18 months ago, but it's coming back. It's rebuilding itself, and has become a major aspect of historic preservation in the last year, with dorks like me who are into historic preservation having major arguments over how do we rebuild it? Do we rebuild it exactly the same? Do we kind of leave it as it is because that's the life of the building, or do we rebuild it in a different way? Lots of arguments on historic preservation, and if you're into that, join me on one of those discussions, certainly. One of the things that you can start to see about how you can start building the walls higher, taller, have the space inside get expanded, and then the walls filled with glass, is you start to need and see the need for these things. So you can see them in all the big time Gothic cathedrals. Those are what's known as the flying buttresses. That is how you're able to support with these Gothic architectural innovations, these gigantic buildings that look like they simply are floating in the sky. When building these things, the flying buttresses, the pointed arch, are your two biggest, most important architectural innovations. The flying buttress certainly was the biggest helper in getting that accomplished. The flying buttress simply is a piece of masonry, and as you can see from the design structures here, it literally, they act as buttresses. They are holding up. If you can think of that physical thing, you are literally holding up, and you've probably all done this with something, where you act as the person who holds up something, all right? And that energy comes from that through you and into the ground, and you kind of use your legs as holding yourself up. If you've ever done like a wall sit or a chair, sit against a wall, for doing some exercises, that's kind of the image that you have in your head, is you're kind of all that force that's going down in your legs to hold yourself up against that wall. That's what a flying buttress does. It takes all of that weight and all of that gravity and channels it down into the ground, okay? And thus you're able to get these spectacular looking buildings. These flying buttresses here, again, perfect example, looking at Saint Etienne in France as well. These buildings are magnificent and majestic, to be sure. Then you could then bring in the stained glass windows, which is everybody's hallmark interior feature of Gothic cathedrals. This allows, the interesting thing about stained glass windows, in my opinion, the most interesting thing about them, yes, is they're beautiful and amazing to look at. But what it is also a way to teach people the scripture, teach them the Bible, teach them the Christian truths that they can't read. Because remember, guys, we're dealing with a largely illiterate population, a majority illiterate population. Some estimates put it at 7 to 8 out of 10 people have no clue how to read during the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. No clue at all how to read. So what you're doing is you're trying to teach them the Bible from pictures. You're trying to teach them the Bible by looking at these stained glass windows. And so that's one of the interesting things about the Gothic cathedral, is you're looking at those aspects of the stained glass windows as a way to literally educate a illiterate population. Probably the best example of a Gothic cathedral is the Cathedral of Chart in France. As you look at those dates, built over the course of nearly 30 years. So remember, these are generational buildings. Chart is, in my opinion, the most majestic to look at. It's the one that you see at the beginning of that PBS documentary. And it's a phenomenal building to look at, and imagine coming upon that building as you would in the Middle Ages. So that's the interesting thing to look at with Chart. You can see just how tall the spires were able to get because of the ability to hold them up with those architectural innovations. Verticality is certainly one of those aspects that you see with the cathedral at Chart. And then Notre Dame here, final picture, just looking at that, just, you do get some aspect of symmetry on the front of Notre Dame here, but then again, as you're looking at it from the side, you can start to see the asymmetrical nature of this Gothic cathedral. That closes out our notes for this semester. And hopefully you guys enjoyed these little video walkthroughs of our notes. If you get a chance, try and view this before our Zoom session tomorrow, but if not, then certainly try and get it done coming up over the weekend so that you're in the best position to succeed on the final exam. So again, that kind of brings our notes to a close. I'll post the downloadable notes here alongside the video in a little bit. And until then, I'll see you guys in the Zoom room for our final session on Thursday. Take care, everybody.